there's not a person in this room who has not used a product or software from Microsoft. We know the company very well, but we don't know a tremendous amount about Microsoft research. And you're on a team there called Epic, which is a great name, by the way. I'm not sure who named it. But tell us, what Microsoft research really focuses on, and more specifically, what you do on the Epic team.
So I think Microsoft research is maybe less known to people who are not on the scientific community, but I would say is the merge of science, computer science in particular, and the big products that have shaped the latest, decades. And successes of Microsoft. Bing came out from there. We have everything virtual reality is coming out from there and then transferring into products. So it's also a very successful story of a lab that is transferring into product. In particular, in my team, we work a lot on creating new interactions. We've been behind the pen and touch interaction that's been leading for our Surface Hub and all of our Surface products. And there are very interesting scientific insights there that you need to transfer of how people manipulate a real pen into how that's going to be successful in a digital pen.
And, you talk about this concept called Society of Devices, speaking of, the Surface line. What is the Society of Devices, and what specifically do you find interesting about it?
So if you ask anywhere, maybe here, when was the last time you sent yourself a document via email? It's kind of crazy how we're still sending ourselves information so we can have it accessible that way, and so we can get it from the phone to the computer, etc. And that's a very big opportunity for us to create things like OneDrive or similar, in which we transfer seamlessly from one device to another. And the better we do this society of devices, the more devices we will be able to sort of tackle. And currently we kind of have this big device that we use for everything, which is the phone. But if there is a seamless connection, there could be many more devices, and they could be the computing much more sparse.
So, and basically that would take us closer to ambient computing, where, there's technology all around us and it's communicating with one another.
Yeah, and the maximum goal there would be that it's seamless for the user.
And you also, really like this idea of mixed reality. Sometimes it feels like we live in a mixed reality, but, it's a technology, apparently. And so explain what the technology is and what promise you think it holds.
So for me, mixed reality is kind of one of the very nice areas to be in research right now. Last year, we celebrated 50 years of virtual reality, invited Ivan Sutherland and Alan Kay and Henry Guro. All these people came over to SIGGRAPH in Vancouver to celebrate these 50 years. And these are people who won the Turing Awards, which is kind of the Nobel Prize of Computer Science. And this is 50-year-old technology that's just hitting the market. And it's a super interesting moment to be in mixed reality. I work on input devices, so I could be working on the mouse, but it hasn't changed for 30 years. So I guess there is an interesting part there of being at the forefront of research that is being transferred.
And that's sort of, on the spectrum between augmented reality and virtual reality, right?
Yeah.
And so, would the HoloLens device, which some of you may be familiar with, it's sort of a Microsoft headset that some frontline workers may use, would that be considered mixed reality, or is that just, augmented reality?
I think it depends on who you ask to. Okay. And I think that's probably something that might be confusing sometimes. So virtual reality is a spectrum of spatial computing in which we embed ourselves inside the digital content rather than having it inside a device. And everything that creates this first-person perspective of interaction, it's going to be considered mixed reality. So there you go, whole way virtual reality in which you cannot see through the real world, all the way to augmented reality in which you see the real world and embed some digital content on it. And that's the spectrum, as you said.
So, many of the folks in the room, and also since I cover enterprise technology, hear these buzzwords all the time for, different types of ascendant or emerging technologies. And, to rattle off a few, there's cloud computing, there's the edge or the fog, there's blockchain, there's the Internet of Things. I'm sure I missed a lot, but which of those do you think is most consequential when we think about spurring innovation?
I think for innovation, we rather go and see it from an abstract perspective. What is innovation, and why should companies think of innovation? And I always think, and I think here people will relate very well as an investment portfolio. You want to have a variety of different technologies that might kick off. And one of the big myths is that we believe we're not doing innovation. Some companies think, oh, I don't do innovation. Well, everybody is doing innovation, so that's the good news. And you're either doing it in-house or you're buying it from someone. So I challenge, and I think this is the part in which executives really need to focus, is what it is that is core to their company, and they should be leading the innovation. Because disruption, so there are like few ways to compete on a market. You can lower prices, you can be different, and many of these things can come from innovation. So if you want to make things more efficient or change completely, and I think innovation is a very good recipe for disruption in that sense.
And there's always this debate when it comes to innovation, whether you buy or whether you develop in-house. There have been some big deals in technology over the last several days. Yesterday, Salesforce buying analytics company Tableau. It previously had struggled in the analytics space, but also didn't try to go as deep into it before Google buying a Looker for similar reasons. How do you think about this debate as someone who works on the front lines of developing new technologies, of whether it's more worthwhile for an overall business to buy or to develop?
I think there is a point in which if you haven't invested on time on doing the research, because it takes time, and it doesn't move as fast as we think. That's, things take 30, 50 years to really kick off. So if you're not there on time, your only chance is really to buy. So, and it's a very decent way of incorporating innovation if you're late to the game. And I think we should be humble about it. And companies are buying because it's actually a very nice way to buy knowledge. So when you see very big companies buying startups, they're kind of kicking out ahead of the game a little bit on that area. And for example, we acquire very nice machine learning team from Montreal, and they have basically joined Microsoft Research. They have not joined any other part of the company. So you're actually sometimes buying research into your innovation labs. And I think that's an interesting way to put it.
No, that definitely is. I wouldn't have expected that. You mentioned startups versus large companies. I'm wondering how you think about, whether a small company that's focused on solving one issue, is more or less, or has the potential to be more or less innovative than a large company like Microsoft, which, can afford to buy a team of researchers.
I think there are a few myths in there. First, I don't think startups are more innovative than big companies. I think there is a bias there on all the many startups we never heard of that failed. I think big companies that are as successful as Microsoft are generally so because they are serial entrepreneurs and they know how to move very fast. and they fail sometimes. And there is a big scrutiny on things that fail, but then you have like amazing successes like Xbox. You know, we were not on the entertainment industry and we're leaders there. And these things only come from your A team that are innovation people who all of a sudden are not afraid to move out of their comfort zone because that's what they're usually doing and create a completely new market for these companies. And I think also these companies have a bet that they only go for the very big billion-dollar business, no? And that makes it even more, the magnitude of everything is higher. But I think that there are very interesting success stories on big companies to be learned from. And there is a reason why there are still big companies after so many years.
And well, speaking of big companies, you know, Microsoft is now a $1 trillion company. It's gone through what my colleagues at Bloomberg Businessweek dubbed an adolescence over the last 5 years. And, you know, I'm wondering, how do you think of Microsoft's approach to managing researchers and the research process? And you had previously been with Airbus. You know, how would you sort of compare those experiences, and what do you think is working well at Microsoft?
I think one of the things that is very intangible is the culture. And the good approach of Microsoft to innovation, in which scientists are left together kind of in a zoo. And I think that's very interesting because there is the tendency to manage research. And managed research means, oh, if I put these researchers into a product team, I'm going to be transferring much faster into product. And I think that's a recipe for failure because generally research is something that is not working yet. So if you put it on a product, you're very likely going to have to delay your release or something like that. So I think the other approach of putting research here sort of in parallel and trying to figure out ways out to graduate into product, I think that's proven to be a bit more successful. But to be fair, transferring to product is something that's very, very hard.
What do you mean by graduate out?
So generally, if you have a scientist and you put the scientist with a bunch of software developers, he will become a software developer. So that's something you want to prevent generally. But sometimes you actually graduate researchers into products. So there are two ways to transfer tech. One is you build tech, you give it to a product, and the product completely scrapes it and start from scratch type of thing. And that's what's happening a lot with Azure. So our networking team, directed by Victor Ball, you know, people who are building their systems are transferring that into our data centers. And the other way to transfer tech is to actually embed this researcher, move him into there. That's a very nice way to transfer research. You transfer the researcher. And there are several of our VPs who came out from Microsoft Research, also, for example, on Azure.
I see. I mean, that makes sense. That's actually really interesting that it's sort of, as soon as they come up with, you know, some breakthrough on networking for cloud technology, they bring it over. But I'm wondering, how does the day-to-day work of the researcher change if they go from, for instance, you know, being a scientist and doing what you do, to having to, you know, work on a line of business and and actually think about, okay, when is this going to come to market? You know, what sort of time horizon do you think about when you're
I think it's a very interesting thing. I call it, they became victim of their own success, because you're such a successful researcher that you offer. This happened to Jamie Tibbons. She was working on micro-productivity very hard. And then, you know, Satya Nadella offered her the TA position. And of course she took it. But that means she's stopping her research on micro-productivity. On the other hand, everybody at the office are talking about micro-productivity now. So she actually had a very successful story. And I think the interesting thing when you have a portfolio of research in your company and you're able to keep it working is that each of the researchers is not just one asset. Each of them has also their own investment portfolio. So you're diversifying a lot. I have 4 or 5 lines of researchers. And every year I move a bit the needle on each one of my teams. And then you test the waters. You see what's sticking, you know. And one day somebody is like, I really need to put this into my product. And I think that's how the best research happens. Very undirected, unexpected. On the other hand, you have other labs that are sort of, okay, have again the same 100 scientists, but they put them in teams of 10 to build more product type of things and bigger projects. No? I'm not saying that's not the way to go, maybe a combination of both, but with that, you're actually telling each of the teams what they should do. And if you fail, you're failing at larger scale. And I don't think your chances of success are higher because you actually have a smaller number of products. So you diversified a bit less by grouping people into teams of 10 versus letting everyone building their own tech.
And so how do you think about productivity or a useful sense of how everyone is allocating their time? Are time horizons just less important for you than for someone who's on the Azure team who has to think about how can we keep up with our competitors?
I think it's, again, portfolio. So you have things 30 years, 10 years, 5 years, 1 year. Even as a researcher, I have the 1-year review every year, and I have to say how I'm making progress in my research. So everybody is sort of balancing their portfolio, even on research. And I only have 1-year review every year. So, the rest of the year is up to me. But when it comes, you have to show up. And I think that when you think of it that way, it scales up very fast because my manager responds to his portfolio of researchers and so on, and it goes to the CFO, who I guess is the important person in the company.
And taking a turn to talk more about disruption and innovation on a macro level, I know that you think a lot about how we can spur disruption in developing countries. For instance, what technologies do you think would be most consequential?
So I think disruption and technology, and the reason why many people don't see it coming is because sometimes it's very non-obvious. For example, you have 3D printing, and you say, the obvious thing is, it's going to disrupt printing. And you're like, no, really? Probably it doesn't. Probably it disrupts logistics. And where in the world are logistics very, very, faulty or missing? And then you think of, okay, IKEA never made it to Africa, but you could be 3D printing tables and chairs in Nairobi without any problem. So you could create some sort of local disruptions with technology, and particularly also with virtual reality or augmented reality. I think there is an enormous possibility for developing countries because these are devices that run on batteries, so you don't need to have power the whole day, 24/7. They are very compact, so you can carry them on the same way they are carrying now phones. The interesting thing is that when you enter a sort of augmented reality or mixed reality headset device, you can render a phone. So it embeds already a phone, but it also embeds a computer. It embeds a TV. It embeds every single piece of digital consumer electronics into one single device. So as soon as we get the price lower, I think this technology will really hit on developing countries, and it's going to be a very strong digital revolution for countries who never went through the Industrial Revolution.
So I guess one day we'll all be wearing HoloLens.
I hope so.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being a great audience. Take care.
Thank you, Marinico. That was fascinating. So we've had a great morning, and to help us wrap things up, I would like to call to stage our final panel. We have joining us today John Frank, who is the QQQ strategist at Invesco, Dave Gideon, Vice President and Head of Research and Product Development for Nasdaq Global Indexes, and Janet Johnston, Portfolio Manager at TrimTabs. So thank you all for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
So we've been hearing a lot today about innovation, and what really strikes me is how much what we consider as innovative has changed over the past 5-10 years. So to start us off with our conversation today, I wanted to ask you, looking at the Nasdaq 100, what companies do you think are really pushing the envelope with what technology can do in the future?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, on an individual company level, I think actually just the last panel with Microsoft and having a full research lab that's fully funded, fully supported, fully developed, and you just kind of see that up and down the 100, whether it's the largest company like Microsoft or one of the smaller companies, you see just that constant degree of reinvestment back into their goods and services. And it's not just on the traditional tech names. You see that with even some of the consumer names that are involved in the Nasdaq 100, let alone the biotech names. I mean, obviously, the large biotechs that make up the 100 are rooted in science and innovation and quite frankly, technology in terms of bettering our lives, whether it's through drugs or medical devices. And so I don't want to pick on any individual name. When you focus on it, you actually just look at the basket of the 100 stocks, the companies that make up the 100. What you see is fantastic R&D spending. Just case in point of what we just listened to and watched. You see success. You see return on that invested capital. So you see high degrees of earning money off of that investment. And then in areas, the other part is actually just the acquisition piece. You see them gobbling up the smaller competitors. Cisco is a great example of that, of being able to constantly innovate, constantly develop, both through their own spending and their own work, but then also through the acquisition side. And so just up and down the list of the index, you see that high degree, and it's one of the reasons why the index has performed so well over the last 10, 15 years is because of that constant innovation.
I think in addition to some of those comments, a lot of, we talk about innovation, invention, I think there's a little bit of difference there. Some companies are creating new things that we didn't even think about. I think Google steps to mind for a company that's kind of coming out with new ideas, and they talk about their moonshoot business. But there's also a company like Amazon who just continually improves upon, I would say, innovating new ways to do the same thing but better. And Dave mentioned about the R&D. One of the things we talk about was, how do you measure innovation? It's really hard to put a number on it, but one of the things we've actually looked at with R&D spending is how much money companies, I talk about QQQ a lot with our clients. So we look at the Nasdaq 100, that's the index that QQQ tracks, and we look at the R&D spend on an average weighted basis, it's over $9 billion for that index. And you compare that to the S&P 500, that's closer to $3 billion. And now that's not really a fair comparison because the Nasdaq 100 are larger companies, so you'd expect them, they're going to spend more on R&D, they have larger budgets. But then when you do it as a percent of sales, so you look at kind of what percent of sales is being reinvested via R&D of these companies, you look at the Nasdaq 100 and it's just above 9%, where the S&P is closer to 5%. So it's this, and it's, R&D is not always going to mean innovation, it's not always going to be successful, but when you have this continual investment for the future over a period of time, we're just seeing dividends today that were investments maybe many years ago. So I think that continual investment over a longer period of time has really put these companies in a position to innovate what looks like from us innovation, but for something that they've been working on for years.
Right. Janet?
Well, we're a big fan of companies that are making smart investments. And I mean, if you look at Amazon, back in 2014, they spent over $75 billion on R&D. And you're seeing it pay off across just a broad range of new products, new areas where they're entering businesses. So we think it's important to stay on the edge.
Definitely. I know that Mara and Nico touched on this a little bit, but when you're looking at innovation by acquisition versus developing new products and really putting the money into the research for the long term, what do you see as a better indicator of success?
I think it really depends on each individual deal, I think, or each individual company. So I think some companies see a void in their own lineup. I never would have thought of Microsoft needing to hire machine learners out of, I don't know if it was Montreal or Toronto. But the idea that they obviously saw something that they recognize and have the foresight to see, this is going to add value to growing our business. And I said that when you see these deals by innovation by acquisition, it probably sometimes doesn't make sense from the outside, but they obviously are looking at thousands of different opportunities and making the best choice. I mean, and a lot of times too is they're buying something and they probably, these companies can pay more for something because they see, hey, we can bring this to the next level. Where I think Instagram's an example of a Facebook purchase. A lot of times people say what a great investment that was. They got lucky, but what would have Instagram done without Facebook? You'll never know that story. But the idea that Facebook said, we can really add value here and help explode this as opposed to build it themselves. On the other hand, a lot of this innovation that they're maybe doing in-house has been worked on for years. So it's, I think that it comes down to what makes more sense for them, and they're in the best position to make that decision, I think, the companies themselves.
Jenna?
I think for us, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if they're building it in-house or if they're doing acquisitions. What counts is if they can turn it into free cash flow and profitability at the end of the day. I mean, that's what's been driving these high-quality companies to new highs. And our research indicates that it's the ability to generate free cash flow that can help deliver alpha over the major market indices.
So we've really looked at technology changing over time, and I think it really makes us need to reconsider what we consider a tech company. So Dave, do you have any thoughts on how we define tech companies? And when we're looking at the FANGs, do you think all of those companies are still traditional tech cos?
Yeah, I mean, I think technology as a term of art is really something that is as a sector basis was created many years ago. And when it was created, the world was very different. And you look out today at what a technology company is doing, and you would either argue every company is a technology or no company is a technology company. I kind of go back and forth between them. But when I think about the large companies, whether it's FANGs or really the companies who comprise the Nasdaq 100 and some of these global leaders, I really just consider them industrials. I mean, they are the modern day, the 21st century industrials, no different than when you look back in 1896 when Charles Dow created the Dow and the very first index. Thanks, Charles. I gotta, helped me out. But you had companies like Chicago Gas and American Sugar, GE. I guess they're still kind of around, but those were the industrials at the day. But today, if you think about what are we calling tech? It's the companies that we need to advance our economic motives. They're companies that we need to make our lives better. They're companies that we need, whether it's social, personal, consumer, business, industrial. These are the companies that you are engaged with every single day. You start a business, you get a Microsoft Excel license, you advertise on Facebook, you go to Starbucks, and you try and get a top key AdWords search on Google. That's your business model. So how is that a tech company, compared to other firms where you really have like the consumer tech, like the smartwatches, GoPros, that type of side. That's really the parlance of tech from 15, 20, 25 years ago that we think about to the names today. Apple is not a technology company because they make a phone. Amazon is not a technology company because they started on a website or they have AWS. That is an industrial product. And if you want to think about tech, think about the sock puppet from 2000, advertising for pets.com. That was sort of that ethos. Today, these are companies who are generating ridiculous cash flow. They're reinvesting, they're acquiring, and that's up and down the market cap spectrum. That's not just the mega caps and FANGs. That's all the way up and down in terms of their ability to generate that free cash flow because they're an industrial component. They are part of our everyday life.
I would echo that too. I think Sylvia used the term tech-enabled or technology-enabled. I think a lot of these companies are utilizing technology to their advantage, whether it's a Tesla. I don't know if you'd say that's a tech company or an auto company, more like an auto company, or Netflix. That's probably less tech and more the fact that they're producing content and really competing against other production companies. So the idea that, and also for me, the question is, too much tech. You're worried about diversification as an investor. are these companies going to move together in sync, which doesn't provide you much what's the point of putting the portfolio together because you don't get the diversification. But these companies are all doing such different things, whether it's social, advertising, retail, actual tech, manufacturing. So I think the idea that the FANG stocks, if you want to say, the worry is that they're all going to be correlated. In reality, they're actually doing very different things. And, one concern is, it was one of the early presentations went through, some of these companies are starting to go towards in the same market. So in cloud, we saw 3 different FANG stocks between Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. So I think that's a double-edged sword as well, because they're going to these markets because they're high margins, they're attractive. So on one hand, it's good that they're kind of going in the same market because it's an attractive place to be, but I do think that does bring more risk of how similar the companies will look. So I think 10 years in the future, they might be more similar than they look today. But I think today, it's also ironic that if you use, depending on what's classification, none of the FANG stocks are actually in the IT sector. So from a standpoint, I think it just matters on what you're looking for in a portfolio and what you care about how they move together with the market cycle.
So it's been a busy IPO year. I'm interested to hear if there are any of the newly IPO tech companies that you're particularly interested in, and how you really judge which of these are appropriate for investment. Janet?
I'll take that. Yeah. We recently did some IPO research going back to 1995, and if you look at IPOs that were launched at over $1 billion and the performance 12 months afterwards, the difference was free cash flow. The companies that had free cash flow outperformed the companies that had negative free cash flow by 16%. And I think, the companies that have had issues that have recently gone public, their path to profitability isn't that clear. And so I think I just wanted to toss that out there because we've been telling investors, I was an economics major, and my first job was as a technology analyst. And so I had to really look at the numbers because I didn't have a good grasp of the actual technology itself. And so, we just think for quality, long-term investments, if you're looking at IPOs, if you look at the free cash flow, that can help determine the winners from the losers.
Yeah, do you think that the private equity market has changed how we consider these companies?
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt, private equity has changed the very nature on really the IPO really the IPO phenomenon because companies can stay private for so much longer and they can raise cash that they need while they're still burning cash through the private equity. It really is delaying out that overall really the overall end user experience for an investor perspective. And so I think we have to balance that out, of course, over the net benefit that private equity venture capital brings in terms of being able to spur innovation without the quarterly cycle. Right. That's a huge part of it in the growth side. Would a company like Uber be able to be in so many different aspects of where they're investing if they had that quarterly cycle? And it'll be interesting to watch them continue their public market side and how that compares